Okay, here's my long-promised color negative scanning tutorial. I'm going to scan a color negative using a Nikon Coolscan V scanner, and I'm going to show you which settings to use in Vuescan. What I'm using in here should work okay with other scanners, but I don't know for sure because I'm just doing this with the Nikon. First of all, you need the professional version of Vuescan to do negative scanning. And I'm using version 9.8.13, which is the current version as of right now when I'm making this tutorial, which is in August of 2023. Let's look here on the left side where all the options are at. I've got a negative already placed in the scanner, but I haven't done the preview scan yet. So we need to set this stuff up first. Options should be set to professional. Task should be scanned to file. Source will have the name of the scanner you're using. If you have more than one scanner connected to your computer, you'll have to choose on this list. I only have one, so it's showing it by default. The Nikon LS-50 is another name for the Coolscan V. Media, you need to select color negative. You got other choices here like image, slide film, and black and white negative, but we're doing color negative, so that's what we're going to choose. Preview area set to auto. Bits per pixel should be 48-bit RGB. Scan from preview should be unchecked. Preview resolution, I just leave it auto. Preview resolution is just how much resolution it should scan the preview to show on your screen. Vuescan will automatically determine what resolution to use based on your screen size, so there's no reason to input that manually. Scan resolution, I have it set to 4000 dpi. That's the maximum DPI that my scanner can do. And I strongly suggest doing your scans at the maximum your hardware is capable of doing. I know there's people who say, well, I'm not going to make a big print. I only need, such and such resolution because I'm not going to do anything bigger than print some 4x6s for my family or something like that. Trust me, if you do that, eventually you're going to need one of those scans in more resolution because someone's going to want a big print of it. And then you're going to have to do the scan all over again, do all the editing in Photoshop all over again, because the scans are never perfect right out of the scanner, especially with color negatives. You're going to have to do some Photoshop work. It's better to start out with the full resolution scan, and then you can always make smaller prints than that. But if you have a small scan that doesn't have enough resolution for big prints, you cannot do that. You need to rescan it then. So save yourself the time and scan it at the maximum resolution. And yeah, the files are bigger, but storage is pretty cheap these days. So I have that set at 4000 DPI because that's what my scanner offers. Auto flip should be turned off. Rotation, just leave that where it's set for now. We'll change that after we do the preview scan. Auto skew and mirror should be turned off. Autofocus should be set at always. Auto scan at none. Auto save at scan. What this means is when it finishes the scan, it will automatically save the file to your computer. Auto print should be none. What that would do would be to make a print as soon as you're done scanning it. We don't want to do that because the scans are not suitable for printing until you've done some editing on them. Auto repeat at none. Okay, number of passes. Some scanners have multi-pass scanning, and what that is it scanned each row of pixels more than once and averages them together, and it's a noise reduction technology. It actually works with scanning color slides really well because sometimes color slides can have a lot of noise in real dark shadow areas. The multi-scanning, if you do more than one scanning pass with slide film, can give you better results. With color negative film and black and white film, I've never seen any difference. So I would leave that set at 1 because if you do, one disadvantage of the multi-scan or the multi-pass scanning is that it makes the scan times a lot longer. If you do 2 passes, that doubles your scanning time. You do 4 passes, it quadruples it. So if you have a lot of scanning to do, it's going to really take up a lot of your time. So it's not necessary to use that for color negatives. Lock exposure, I leave it off. Red, blue, and green analog gain, I just leave them set at 1. That's the default. The default folder is going to be where you want them saved on your computer. So you would click the little @ sign here and then choose a folder on your computer where you want the scans to be saved. Default options should be turned off. TIFF file name, you can ignore that for now. These other settings, we need to do the preview scan before we set this other stuff, so let's go ahead and do that. I've got the negative in the scanner, so we hit the preview button, and it's going to do the preview scan, which only takes a few seconds. You hear the scanner doing all of its mechanical stuff, doing the autofocusing and pulling the negative through the scanner. You can see the preview looks really awful. It's going to look like that until it actually finishes, and then it will change in appearance and look more normal, which you see that now. Okay, now we have our preview scan. This is a photograph of my cat sitting in front of one of my neighbor's cars. The next thing we want to do once we've got this is check the rotation. I've got it set at right now, which is correct. If the picture were if it were set at none, the picture would look like this because my scanner scans the pictures vertically. So you would set the rotation to turn the image so that it looks normal, whichever direction it needs to be turned. In this case, it's right. Now we go up to crop here. I leave that set at manual, and I don't touch any of this other stuff. You don't have to. And the reason for that is that you can do the cropping by grabbing the little dots here on the four sides and moving the cropping however you want it to be done. And you want to make sure you're not, getting these ugly borders and such. You're going to want to crop those off later anyway, so you might as well have the scan software do it for you. Once you've got the cropping set, the other thing you want to do is see this little circle right here. It looks like a little cross with a dot in the middle of it. You can move that, and what that is it's your focus point. So you want to find something in the picture that has fine detail that it can focus on, because the scanner actually focuses on the image on the negative. It focuses on detail. So if you were to put the focus point on something like this side of the car here that has no detail, it's just flat tone, it may have a hard time focusing and giving you a sharp image. So you want to choose something like the cat's face is a good one. His little fine hairs are good to focus on, or some of this dried grass, whatever here. Since the cat is my main subject, I'm going to go ahead and scan on his face as the focus point. Next thing we're going to go to is filter. And this has several options on here. Infrared cleaning is something you can use for color negatives and for color slides. It does not work on black and white film. But since we're doing color negatives, we can use this. And what it does is it detects any dust and sometimes scratches that are on film and repairs them for you, reduces the amount of Photoshop work you have to do getting rid of dust spots. And there will be dust spots. It's almost impossible to get a negative 100% perfectly, totally 100% dust-free before you stick it in the scanner. So you should clean the negative as carefully as you can before you put it in the scanner. But there's always going to be a few of them that you miss, and this helps eliminate that. Now there's different settings. You can turn the infrared cleaning off if you don't want to use it, or you can choose light, medium, or heavy. Generally, I only set it on the light setting, unless I have a picture that's got a bunch of scratches or big pieces of embedded dust on it. And the reason I don't use the heavier settings is because the medium and heavy settings reduce resolution a bit, especially the heavy setting. The light setting, I haven't seen any difference in resolution with using it, so it's perfectly fine to do. So I would, for the most part, I always set it on light when I'm scanning color negative. I don't use the medium or heavy settings unless I absolutely have to, because as I said, they do make the scan slightly softer. Restore colors and restore fading are things that are mostly used for if you have a very old color negative that has faded. Sometimes these can help restore the color and make it look nicer. We're not going to use them for this because this is a color negative that I shot about a month ago, so it's a brand new film that's absolutely not faded. The grain reduction, I would not use that. I found that it substantially reduces resolution. And I also don't do any sharpening at the scanning stage. If you need to do any sharpening a negative at the scanning stage tends to make the grain a lot sharper and make the picture look a lot grainier, so I tend to not do that. I sharpen the pictures before I scan them once I've resized them to the final print size, but I don't do any sharpening on the original scan. Next tab is the color tab. Now this one here is the one that's the important one for color negatives. And color negatives are so hard to get good color from because they have that orange or brown colored mask on the film that has to be removed by the software. And Vuescan has a bunch of different options. The first thing we're going to look at here is black point and white point. By default, these are not set at 0. I think the white point is normally set at 1 or 2 or something like that, and the black point is normally 0 by default. I set those at 0 to ensure that there's no clipping of highlight and shadow values. The scans will be a little bit flatter and lower in contrast, which is okay. We can fix that in Photoshop later. It's better to have a negative that's too flat that you can increase the contrast on later rather than have one that was scanned in with some highlight or shadow clipping, because you can't fix that once that's happened. So we leave these at 0. The curve low and curve high, these are for adjusting contrast, and I found that it's a very, it's not a very elegant solution in Vuescan because you have to put in numbers or move these sliders, and it's not very precise. I just leave them at the default, and I do any of this adjustment that needs to be done in Photoshop. And you will have to adjust them. The scan's going to look flat when it comes out, so you're going to have to increase contrast and change color balance and such in Photoshop, but I just leave these at default. The brightness for overall brightness and for red, blue, and green. The overall brightness is if it scans in too dark, you can lighten it or darken it. That one can be useful sometimes. The ones for the red, blue, and green would allow you to adjust color balance, but I found that a lot like the curve settings up here, it's not a very precise or useful solution in Vuescan. It's better to do that in Photoshop. So I just leave those at the default. Now here's the big one, negative vendor. You can choose manufacturers here like Fuji and Kodak. And if you choose a manufacturer, we'll choose Kodak here. This film that I'm scanning is actually Portra 400. You choose a manufacturer and then you get brands, which is like the different films made by Kodak. So there'd be things like Gold or Portra or Advanix or whatever. So we can choose down here, we can go down and you can see all these different options. Some of these are films they don't even make anymore, but Vuescan still has the options for them. Some are black and white films, which we want to ignore too. We're using Portra, so I'll choose Portra, and then you have the different choices of which Portra film you're using. Unfortunately, they've never updated this because Kodak doesn't make the 160 NC and VC or the 400 NC and VC films anymore. Those were discontinued about 12 years ago. Now there's just Portra 160 and there's Portra 400 and Portra 800. So I tried doing scans with this when I was preparing for this tutorial, choosing the Portra 400 settings. I tried both of them, and I didn't really see a lot of difference. Now there's another setting up here, and this is the one I really want to call your attention to. If you choose the name generic instead of choosing an actual manufacturer name, then these change to color negative, so you get generic color negative. I've actually found in Vuescan from doing color negatives, and not just this Portra film, but other films that I've scanned in the past, Fuji films, other Kodak films, and whatever. Almost always I get better color with the generic color negative setting compared to choosing an actual individual film stock. So if I were you, I would not choose, like for the Portra film I'm using, I wouldn't choose the Kodak Portra 400 setting that's available because I found that it actually gave pictures that were harder to color correct. I got better results using the generic color negative setting, and that's what I would recommend to you as a starting point. You should play with the other settings and see what you get with it. With other films, they may be better than they are with Portra, but in my experience, even doing other Kodak films and doing Fuji films, I've always, in almost every instance, preferred the generic color negative setting. So that's what I would choose if I were you. Scanner color space should be left at default unless you have individually profiled your scanner, which virtually nobody has done. So for the most part, I would leave that at default. Printer color space doesn't matter because we're not going to print from Vuescan. You can leave that set at anything. It's not going to affect your scans. That's only something that's used if you're making prints out of Vuescan. Film color space, I leave at default. If you've done an ICC profile of an individual film with your scanner, you can choose that, and that might give you more precise results. I've never done that, so I don't have a profile for this film. So in that case, you would leave it at default. Show IT8 outline. This is something that's used for making this is for making profiles from films if you want to do that with Vuescan. Vuescan has that functionality, and since we're not doing that now, we're actually scanning a regular film, we leave that unchecked. Output color space. This is one where you got a choice. I usually do my scanning in Adobe RGB because I have a monitor that displays the Adobe RGB color space. I know there's some people who prefer to use like ProPhoto RGB, which is a wider color gamut. But I've really not seen any films that have a color gamut big enough, much bigger than the Adobe RGB as far as color negative films. And ProPhoto RGB is hard to edit on a computer because the color space is a lot bigger than what any monitor can display. And so it can make it hard to get to do the color balancing on them. I prefer to use Adobe RGB. Some people might prefer to use sRGB, which is a much smaller color space than Adobe. And that's fine if you're going to do stuff that's only going to be put on the web, but if you're making prints, you should use a wider color gamut like Adobe RGB because most modern printers can print a wider color space than sRGB. So even if you don't understand what that color space stuff is, just choose Adobe RGB. You'll get good results that way. Monitor color space. This affects how the picture displays in Vuescan's preview screen. I have a calibrated monitor, so I've chosen my monitor's profile, which you would do by clicking ICC profile, and then down below you would use this, click the little @ sign to choose the actual location on your computer where the profile is. If you don't have a calibrated screen, and you should have a calibrated screen, if you don't have one, I recommend learning to do so and getting a colorimeter like the i1 or the Spider calibrators that go on your screen and adjust the color. If you don't have a calibrated screen, any editing you do is basically just guessing because the pictures may not match what you see on your prints when you make prints from those pictures if you don't have a good calibrated screen. View color RGB, we'll leave that alone. Now we'll go over here to output. This Vuescan is confusing because for some reason they have a place where you can choose the folder that you want the scans to save in two different places. We've got it up here in the output tab, and we had it again, first of all, back in the input tab. And whichever you set here will automatically show up here, so you don't have to set it twice. Below that, you choose what kind of a file you want. You can choose a TIFF or a JPEG or a PDF. PDFs are mostly if you're scanning documents. You don't want to scan a photograph as a PDF. I would not recommend JPEGs either because film scans need a lot of editing to bring the contrast and color up to where they should be. And JPEGs just can't take that kind of editing without falling apart and getting color banding and other problems. So you should scan it as a TIFF file. If you choose the TIFF option, then you have up here other options that go with that. Multi-page should be off because we're just doing individual pictures. File type should be 48-bit RGB, which is another thing we chose in the input tab, but you have to choose it here. And if you choose it in the input tab, it may not necessarily have transferred over here, so you need to make sure you have it set in both places as 48-bit RGB. Compression I leave off. Click the thing that says TIFF profile. That means it'll save a color profile with it, which you want. Printed size, I leave it to say scan size and magnification at 100%. You can type in a description and copyright and stuff here that'll appear in the metadata for the file if you wish. And then the next thing we go over to is preferences. And most of the stuff you can pretty much leave alone. I think all this stuff is left at the default. So now that we've gone through all the settings and we have the color settings set the way we want, and you can see here the color isn't great. It's too low in contrast. It's kind of looks a little too cyan in color, not red enough. That's fine. I'm not going to try to adjust color balance in Vuescan. Oh, there is one more thing too in the color tab. We didn't discuss this. Where it says color balance, there are choices here: white balance, auto levels, night, fluorescent, landscape, portrait. I found the white balance setting gives files that are the easiest to edit later. So I would stick with that. You can experiment with the other ones and see what you get. You can see on the screen here how they change. This looks a little bit greener using the auto level setting. We're not getting a whole lot of difference from choosing these different ones on here, but some other images, I know with slide film I sometimes see a bigger difference between the different choices, but I'm going to choose white balance. I think that works best for color negative films in my experience. So once we've got everything set here, and like I said, this preview doesn't look great. It's too low in contrast. It's not red enough. The color's off. That's fine. We'll have to fix that stuff later in Photoshop. Scanning software is really not for photo editing. The purpose of a scan is to get the most information you can get off of the negative, so that you can have a file that can be edited later to get it perfect. So that's what we're going to do here. We're going to scan this, and then we're going to edit it in order to get it finally up to where it should be. So we'll hit scan. And the scanning is going to take a little bit longer because it's scanning at 4000 dpi for that. And you can hear my loud scanner making all of its noises. It's sitting next to the microphone. Now I'm not going to make you wait through this whole process, but once it finishes scanning, and you can see that the scan looks far worse here. It'll change and look more like the previous scan once it's finished. But I'm going to go ahead and skip up to the point where we open up Photoshop and do our editing in there. Here's our finished scan now, and you can see it looks just like the preview did as far as color and contrast and everything. We need to open it in Photoshop now, which I've done. The first thing we need to do is increase the contrast because it's very flat looking. So we're going to use a curves adjustment layer. If you don't know how to do adjustment layers, check out my video and my written tutorials on that on crawfordphotoschool.com. And we're going to use the curves. And you can see here the contrast is looking much nicer now. It's bringing it up closer to normal, but the color is way off. So I'm going to do another curves adjustment and try to adjust color balance. And everything looks very blue. So we're going to reduce blue, but now it all looks very green. And so we're going to reduce green. Still looks a little bit too greenish to me. So this is increasing the red some more is making the cat look a little nicer, but some of the other stuff in the picture is looking a little off. I think it still needs some more contrast though as part of it. Oh, there we go. Now we're getting a little closer to what we want as far as contrast is concerned. It's a little too light though overall, so let's darken it up. Yeah. Now the color is still not quite perfect. It's not bad because this was shot on an overcast kind of rainy day, so this is actually pretty close to what things really look like. But I want to try to get rid of some of that kind of reddish tone it looks like it has. See, it's still too blue in the highlights. One problem with color negative scanning is that I see a lot of color crossover where the color balance may be different in the light tones than it is in the dark tones, and that is a real pain to fix. And the way you do that is you choose a color channel, and it's too blue in the highlights, so we're going to pull the highlights down, and you can see that that's making this look more of a neutral white. I think it's still a little bit too blue in the shadows too, though. What's this up here? Doesn't look quite right either. That's, if we look at our info palette here, we can see it says it's not quite red enough in the highlights. The green and blue settings are both a little too high. So let's go to red. Maybe go a little higher just in the light tones. I have a curves tutorial that explains what I'm doing here, but if you pull upwards on the top part of the curve, that affects highlights, or if you pull downward, if you basically any adjustment to the upper end of the curve, it affects highlights, and stuff done to the lower end of the curve affects shadows, and stuff done to the middle tone, the middle area, affects your midtones. And so what I've done is I put a dot in the midtone and then another dot up here, so that when I pull the highlights up, then it kind of rotates around this axis here, and the shadows get a little dark, get a little lower. So, yeah, I think the color balance in this actually looks pretty good now. This is very close to what I saw in the original scene. So, I think that's a pretty good look. We might want to increase the contrast a little. Let's see what we got here. Yeah, that's much nicer. Make the tires closer to looking black, which they are. We still actually have some good detail a little bit underneath the car, so I think that looks a lot better. And our highlights, this is a white building, but it's not that light because I don't want to lose detail in this silver chrome trim around the window of the car. I don't want that to get blown out. So if we look at the info palette, that's like at 14%, so it's not quite that high yet. We might even be able to go a little higher. Makes the whites here look a little nicer, but I think that's getting too light in this part of the car. I think I'm going to pull it back down and leave it where I had it. Kitty's rendered really nicely. This is sneaky for those of you who are familiar with my kitty. He's got his own YouTube channel too, and his own Instagram page. He's more famous on Instagram than I am. He's got over like 4,300 followers now. So yeah, he looks nice. So I think we're good. I think we're done with this one.